again, focus on some wind topics today, but instead of our normal building realm that we typically live in as structural engineers, we're going to focus on our non-building structures. And admittedly, as a California engineer, these are our structures that are always wind controlled. And even for our non-California engineers, these non-building structures are often the ones that have less clarity in the building code, yet always end up on our roofs attached to our buildings. And so that's where we're going to spend our time here today. Before we get started, I want to just briefly point out how we got here as an area of focus. And so I just would like to highlight for you the NCSCA Wind Committee often, well, every code cycle reaches out to our membership and asks practicing engineers like you what you would like to see changed in the wind sections of ASCE 7. And while 4 of these 5 answers aren't terribly relevant, I'll go through them here for you today. The first one is to simplify the provisions, which I recognize is a longstanding desire of many practicing engineers. The second most common response was to go back to UBC provisions. The third one was to stop changing. And then here, the fourth one is the important one for here today. The fourth most common response to this question was to provide more guidance on open structures, canopies, tall parapets, solar PV, and screen walls. So kind of those non-building structures that we're going to talk about here today. And so what I'd like to do is provide for you a little feedback on where ASCE 7 did pick up this sentiment to item 4. Specifically, the NCSCA Wind Committee went to ASCE 7/16 and said, hey, here are the things we would like you to do as a result of the feedback we're hearing from practicing engineers. And so a lot of what you're going to hear today is either been implemented in ASCE 7/16, or we'll mention a few things here in ASCE 7/22 as well. Goal here is hopefully to highlight to you that there are some advocates in the code world for the practicing engineer, and I certainly welcome your feedback throughout the presentation today on your wishes and desires, particularly as it relates to these non-building structures. So I mentioned before, NCSCA went to ASCE 7, and I'm briefly just going to show you the things that were asked. The first one was to reduce the number of methods down to really one analytical method and one simplified method. The second one was to really work on some consolidation of provisions. The third one here, and we'll talk about this explicitly here today, was to provide criteria for some of these commonly encountered conditions like canopies, tall parapets, mechanical screens, and PV panels. And I'll say, in some cases that was done, and we'll talk about where that was done here today. In some cases it wasn't, but I still intend on providing you guidance, even if it's not explicit in the code. The fourth question, or fourth request from NCSCA to ASCE 7 was to provide design procedures for rooftop units on taller buildings. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we've had provisions for rooftop units for low-rise structures for a while. Taller structures, the code has been silent. The fifth request was to simplify freestanding wall provisions, which didn't actually happen. It was not a success in ASCE 7, but we are going to spend some time talking about it here today, and hopefully I can provide a little bit of clarity or simplification there. And then the last one was to provide some guidance on irregular building configurations. What you'll see are these 3 in color coding: red, green, and blue. We are going to talk about explicitly here today. The first one being rooftop equipment, the second one being solar PV, third one, rooftop screen walls. The fourth one, as I alluded to, isn't an actual change in ASCE 7, but we will spend quite a bit of time on freestanding walls and signs. We'll talk about tall parapets, what to do if your parapet starts to get quite tall, and see if there's any nuance there that the designer needs to be aware of. We'll talk briefly about tanks and silos. I realize this is a pretty niche market, but I do want to just highlight some changes in the provisions there. We'll talk about some of these structures that have repetitive members, such as a trellis. We'll finish up talking about canopies attached to buildings. So with that being said, before we dive into those very specific topics, I just want to remind you where we live when we're talking about ASCE 7 and non-building structures. So I'm going to start with ASCE 7.10. I find that that's still where a lot of engineers' comfort zone is, although we will talk about changes in 7.16. So if you're doing main wind force, So if we are looking at a rooftop screen wall, for example, and we need to get all the wind load from that rooftop screen wall, dump it into our roof diaphragm, and distribute it to do our shear wall design. We're looking at main wind force loads. We're in chapter 29. So the interesting thing for main wind force is that our non-building structures have their own chapter. So we don't have to be in chapter 27 or 28. Those are really building focused. We go to chapter 29 and it's a standalone chapter just for these non-building structures.